IMF develops transparency code for central banks. Naira appreciates to 1,382 per dollar. MPC members express fear that excess cash in circulation may worsen inflation. Now, these are top business picks, and joining me to make sense of these, I have Mokhtar Mohammed, the CEO of Asher Investments Limited. Thank you for joining me today, Mokhtar.
Thank you for having me.
But I would like us to begin with the update of the International Monetary Fund's code on, central bank transparency. The 1999 IMF Code of Good Practices on Transparency in Monetary and Financial Policies, that's MFPT. One of the key standards developed by the IMF identified desirable transparency practices for central banks and other financial agencies. Now, why has it become necessary or even imperative to have this update?
It's very necessary because the world, is a global village, and then things are getting better by the day. You need to improve. A lot of information are trickling in. And then again, I'm sure most of these modules are mostly designed for developing economy like ours. And all you need to do is to look at what has happened around our economy, how our politicians have used the central bank as a tool for their own personal gain. So I think they are looking at that. I like what they said. They looked at corporate governance, they look at transparency, they look at policies that the central bank should be involved in. All you need to do is to look at the last CBN administration. You want to ask yourself, maybe it's because of that they are bringing a lot of these models apparatus, because it seems that we're guilty of almost everything that the International Monetary Fund, IMF, was saying in trying to upgrade these models. So I think it's a good one, but I like the other side that they said that it's not just copy and paste. Central bank must also look at their own peculiarity of their own environment and update it, but they just feel that this could be a template for them to use. So for me, I think that's a good one. Most central banks are autonomous, and the central bank in Nigeria are autonomous, but yet they are not autonomous because they still have to go to the National Assembly to approve their budget. And I think that's what also they are saying there. To be able to get your own budget and do your own things yourself, so that you don't involve, you don't get into politicians trying to get one thing or the other, twisting your hands to go in their favor in terms of monetary policy decisions.
Well, talking about that, the previous administration comes to mind, Godwin Emefiele, and even wanting to become the president of Nigeria. But away from that, I know you've highlighted some of them, but I would like you to talk specifically on the major highlights of the CBT. What are the things that actually set it apart from what we had before now?
I think nothing really, but the only thing is in the area of corporate governance, transparency, and then I think budgeting, where they said that the CBN should be, most CBN should be able to have their own budgeting by themselves. I think most of the things that they said they were all there before now. So, but the transparency one is good. If you look at transparency is doing like a CBN like ours did not release the audited result for over 7 years. And so they had to do one of releasing of audited results. And so those are part of transparency, being open. When you talk about budgeting, like I said, the CBN Nigeria still goes to the National Assembly to approve their budget. And also when you talk about interventions, they said something there, you should always intervene in monetary policy things, not trying to intervene in physical authority issues. So I think there's nothing really new about what has happened, but it's just a gentle reminder, and then emphasizing the area of transparency. And like I said, one of those transparency must be related to your own peculiarity of your own environment.
All right, talking about transparency, I mean, it sort of stands out when you actually read the full document. But then the Central Bank Transparency Framework emphasizes transparency across all aspects of central bank operations. While this promotes public trust, there may still be situations where confidentiality is necessary. So how can the CBT, with its 5-pillar framework, effectively navigate this potential conflict? I mean, can robust transparency coexist with legitimate needs for confidentiality in certain circumstances? And when we talk about confidentiality, maybe you can highlight some of the areas where that is actually necessary. So at the end of the day, we've got transparency, but when we need to, keep some things in confidence, we also do that.
Well, if you're a financial institution, there's no more confidence in the way that you do your business. I think you are open to the books. Oh, excuse me. You are open to the books of your government to begin to look at a lot. I mean, especially your Nigerian people. So and I'm talking about Nigeria. I don't think confidentiality could come in the area of security, especially security of the printing of your currency. I think that's where the confidentiality comes. Doesn't mean you mustn't tell them the cost, but giving them details about how you're going about printing it or what. I think that's the confidentiality that I think should be there. But in terms of transparency, you must be as open as a book. You must let them know where you're intervening, what you're intervening in, not just keeping everybody in secrecy, then hiding in the name of confidentiality. I don't think that is something we should worry about. They emphasize on transparency because they've realized that most of the challenges we have in developing economy, especially in Africa, has to do with transparency. Like I said, you have to look at Nigeria. Until the edited report was released, you didn't know that they were owing and Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, and when this result was released, when you deduct from what they are owing, you realize that Nigerian funds that was just about $4 billion, even if they have come out to clarify those issues. So I think transparency is key, especially when you are the CBN of a financial economy. I mean, the financial gateway to your economy. Then foreign investors need to see transparency before they want to come into your economy.
All right, let's move on to the other conversation about Naira appreciating. Now, the central bank governor has made it clear that he wants to restore transparency and confidence in the forex market. Now, with the Naira closing at 1,382 per dollar yesterday, it would seem, he's walking the talk. So first, let me get your reaction to this appreciation.
Good news, Perpetua. We've talked about the Naira for so long, from 1,800 to 1,300. Wow, that's quite a move in a month. But some people will say, oh, where are we coming from? But where were we going? And so where we're coming back now, I think it's a huge commendation to go to the CBN, even if I will not, I don't agree with all they've done, but at least we must commend them where they have roll up the sleeve and do the real hard work. We will keep saying that the problem with the Naira had nothing to do with a lot of things the CBN were fighting. It has everything to do with liquidity. And I kept saying it, I think your program, that the main thing that the CBN need to do is to improve liquidity, settle the backlog of what you have. The Naira would definitely appreciate. And I think maybe they listen and that's what they've done. They've settled the backlog, and then there seems to be a wash of a lot of dollar in the economy. Now, and I said it then that you don't fight speculators. Speculators are part of the market. You only come up with a better policy to deal with speculators. And that is what they have done now. So the speculators are now scared. They are now bringing out their FX, their dollar for to sell. And that is putting more pressure on the dollar. And again, the game changer will come when by very soon NNPC, Dangote finally comes on stream. If you looked at the report from the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics, 70% of our FX pressure is caused from importation of refined petroleum products. If we are able to reduce that even by 50%, we're even only doing 25%, you can see how much that will reduce the pressure of the Naira to the dollar. So good news everywhere. I think it's commendable what the CBN have done. We must give them kudos for it. I must tell them not to lay on their leg, because even the CBN governor have said that the Naira is grossly undervalued, and he's making sure he want to workshop that the Naira gets its true value. And not just the Naira getting its true value, Nigerian trusting the Naira. That is the key. Because the challenge we've seen is that it seems that a lot of Nigerians do not trust the Naira. And those, so they tend to hold other currency than the Naira. So for you to bring that trust back to the Naira, you must make the Naira stable. Stability is key, just like the airline operators are saying that we don't want to be coming to the import and export window. Today is 800, tomorrow is 850. That does not help businesses. You must make sure that there is stability in terms of those rate changes. It will not go beyond 1 or 2%. That also had to it. Even if the airline operators are saying that their backlog, they still have about 700 million. But the
Okay.
CBN have always said, proof, come with proof, and we will pay it up. I think what has really happened, I'm sure, was that there was a time that most of the airlines were collecting dollars from Nigeria to travel. and now you've collected dollar, you want to return naira and collect naira. I don't think that works. So we must give them kudos. If that is really what is happening, then the CBN has done a great job.
All right, so do you see this momentum being sustained? We've talked about certain things that can bring in the dollar and also reduce pressure on the naira. So looking at maybe the short to medium term, do you see the CBN sustaining what it is doing? And also you talked about the CBN, improving liquidity. And I'm wondering, is it even the CBN that's supposed to improve dollar liquidity?
Well, excuse me. There's a saying that we say there must be a partnership between the physical and the monetary side. So that partnership will come, like I said, the physical side. Once we stop the importation of most of these refined petroleum products, that is a game changer. They've saved over 50% in terms of FX, and that will find its way into the Nigerian treasury, and Nigerian foreign reserve. And now, if you look at that reserve has improved almost 35 billion now from a low of almost 30 billion. Now, but when you look at that, by and by the 5 point something billion they have paid thus far, you will be saying that the reserve have almost reached 40 billion, which is an encouraging thing. That means the physical side are doing what they're. Now, how do we attract efforts into the economy? We attract efforts by Nigeria in the diaspora, and recently the CCBN is telling us that has improved, and that will also be responsible for the kind of liquidity we are seeing in the system. Foreign direct investors, they are definitely coming in. Foreign portfolio investors, they are also coming in, even if they're not coming in, they're huge number. They are trickling in, and very soon when they realize that there's stability, most of them will come in. And lastly, the sale of refined petroleum products. Like I said, um, presently now it seems like the government is paying revenue in one area or the other in the refined petroleum product. So hopefully by the time we begin to have local manufacturing, and then most of what we consume will be consumed from local production, then that also could bring down the cost of it, could bring down the cost of most of this pressure also on the naira. So a lot of things seems to be going well for Nigeria at the moment. In the short term, yes. In the medium term, they need to push structure, because like I said, perpetual, we have been to this route before. We've always been here, but we'll maneuver our way off it. But when same issue comes again 5 years after, we are back to that point. So it's not about stabilizing the rate. It's about maintaining stability in the rate for a very long time without external shock affecting what. And the only way we can do that is to make sure that we grow our economy inwardly to be able to export outside the shore of this country. That is what will create the stability in the long run.
All right, just before we leave this particular one to the next conversation, I remember stepping out to fill the pulse of, micro business owners. And they said to me that a good exchange rate for them would be between 600 to 700 to $1. Would that be a fair value for the Naira? I mean, I'm asking you as an analyst. They spoke as people who are into business and, they don't want something to keep affecting them. So what do you think?
I think let's look at the fair value to the naira to be between 800 and 850, because when you look at the benchmark, according to it's about 800. The CBN also have said that the naira to the dollar is grossly undervalued, and I think the undervalued also is thinking about 800. At the point they were looking at 700, if you remember the presidential committee, the presidential chairman of the presidential committee on tax was saying about 700 to 750. But I think we have moved past there. I think 800, 850 could be reasonable, better for the naira.
All right, so let's move now to the other one. That's currency in circulation. I have to say that when I saw the news, CBN posted it on its website on Monday. I wondered if there was another MPC, because these statements were made in February. Beg your pardon, that was at the first MPC in 2024, which was last month. So is this to prepare Nigerians for another rate hike? That's what it seems like to me.
Well, I'm not for a rate hike at this moment because of the kind of jumbo hike that we saw. It seems like they just model all the hike that they have not done before and hike it at once. I'm not expecting that this time. But again, with the manner of inflation, like they've said, removing excess liquidity, yes, that's a challenge. But the major cause of inflation is food price, and food price does not go up because of excess; it goes up because of supply. So excess liquidity is in the system, quite all right. But that's not the main cause. That's not what is mainly fueling inflation. We need to deal with what is really fueling inflation, and is the rising cost of living. So we need to deal with that. And depends on how we want to deal with that. This is where the physical side comes in. If they decide to reduce tariff, especially on most of these agricultural product that Nigeria mostly consume, that could also help in driving down inflation rather than just putting so much effort in wiping up liquid. I'm not saying that's not part of the problem, but the major part that have really driven Nigeria economy to where it is now is the rising cost of living, especially basic cost of living like food, shelter, and others. So those are what is driving this inflationary pressure. So, and CBN on their own cannot attack it alone. They need to involve the government. The fiscal side need to do that. If you begin to hike rate, like we have said, we have seen rate hike in UK, and we have seen where it has resulted to. The numbers have come down. We started almost at the same time in the US, the same thing, but rather our own keeps going up. So that shows that the fundamental issues must be addressed to begin to see commensurate result in raising of rates.
All right, I want us to take a look at, one of the statements made by a member of the MPC, that's Pauline Odinkemelu. She said growth in money supply, that's M3, rose by 18.25% to 93.72 trillion naira at end January 2024 over the preceding December. Broad money, that's M2, and narrow money, M1, grew by 17.81 and 3.68% respectively at end January 2024. So what are the dynamics of these three, and how did they affect the economy or the macro economy at the end of the day? Because I've listened to your arguments talking about how that, yes, there is, we have money in circulation, but then what is fueling what we are experiencing isn't just this money in circulation. So I'd like you to help us understand, the thinking of the MPC really.
I think the thinking of the SCC was capture one thing that they said during their communique after the first meeting. They said largely about 50% of the inflationary pressure that we are experiencing is driven largely by the FX volatility. And they said they were going to address it. And like you found out, at that time they were estimating it was about 1,600. And so they are now beginning, that's official experience at that time. They are now beginning to address it, and we have seen it move to 1,300. And we still expect it to go further. So that means they are looking at it that the main cause of inflation actually is the FX and volatility. And so they once they address that, and that volatility is being fueled because of lack of liquidity. Immediately they clear the backlog of what they have in the airline industry and a lot of that. They have injected liquidity into the system, and that's where we got the result we are having now. So basically, I think in as much as I agree with what they are saying, but they must address the root cause of why we have those inflationary pressure has to do with FX liquidity. And the only way you can address that is to create stability and to make sure that demands of legitimate business are met soon rather than soonest.
All right, thank you. I actually wanted you to, to dwell a little on, the excess cash and all the M1, M2, M3 and, what it portends. But of course, we have to leave that there. Thank you for joining me, Mukhtar Mohammed, CEO, Asher Investments Limited.
Thank you for having me.
South African Speaker Nosiviwe Mapisa-Nqakula is required to hand herself over for arrest on Friday following a graft investigation. Reports of Nosiviwe Mapisa-Nqakula's imminent arrest follow an early morning raid by law enforcement authorities on her Johannesburg home on 19th March. The move is part of an investigation into claims that she had solicited a cash bribe of around 2.3 million rands via mobile phone text messages from a former military contractor during her time as Minister of Defense between 2012 and 2021. From Cape Town, South Africa, I have Sanusi Naidu, Senior Research Fellow at Institute for Global Dialogue. Thank you so much for joining me today.
And thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
Absolutely. Now, investigators raided the Speaker's home on Tuesday as part of the corruption inquiry, but did not provide further details on the investigation or the corruption allegations, although there are reports on what this could be about. Tell us, what are the details of the corruption allegations leveled against the Speaker?
Well, I think it's part of the ongoing investigation that's happening in terms of what was reported in a media report about 2 or 3 weeks ago about the Speaker of the National Assembly being implicated, allegedly, for now, because we still have to go through the investigation and for the investigation to find its evidence. But there is a company that's led by a former colleague of I wouldn't say of the speaker, but linked to a company that is linked to somebody who worked in the SANDF at the time, and claims that she had been at various points asked to provide bribes in different types of code words used, totaling to the value of about $2.2 million, a million rand. And this in itself is the subject of the inquiry. So I think the company and the whistleblower has been given some kind of deal with the SIU and the Hawks, and of course, as you rightly point out, in the insert, charges have been dropped, but I don't think they've dropped completely. There's some kind of agreement in place with the whistleblower, and in terms of what she's claiming in the context of the fact that the speaker has demanded bribes. So the raid on the speaker's home in the past couple of days was really, I think, around this issue in terms of trying to piece together whatever evidence they could get. And of course, what has happened this morning is that the speaker has not been arrested, and that needs to be emphasized. And there's a lot of hype in the media, both here and outside of the country, suggesting or intimating that the speaker has presented herself to be arrested. No, she has not. I think these things need to be clarified, because this is where misinterpretation and misinformation becomes the kind of trajectory of what's going forward. She has actually issued a countervailing application to demand the kinds of things that she's demanding for in terms of the raid on her house and what they were looking for, and to go one step further and demand that she needs to, these things need to be verified in the context of her being implicated in this whole issue around the bribery. And then the second issue is there was a spike in the media as well to suggest today that the speaker was going on a trip to Switzerland, but now we hear that she's on special leave, that she would not be in Parliament. And Parliament is going to rise in the next 2 to 3 weeks, because we go into an election in May, and Parliament only has about 2 or 3 weeks left. If you take away next week and the following week, then Parliament will actually have to be dissolved. And so for the new Parliament to be constituted, this Parliament has to be dissolved. So in effect, the Speaker just has about 2 weeks as effectively as the Speaker of the National Assembly. And so there are questions being raised. I mean, this morning we also heard that the opposition party, the Democratic Alliance, has issued its own court application to demand that the speaker be held accountable, to demand that some kind of legal framework is taken forward.
Right.
Again, in terms of where she is and what she's doing, and should she be reprimanded in the context of the parliamentary ethics?
All right, thank you so much. Okay, I mean, you just answered like 3 questions, so I didn't even bother stopping you since you were already answering some of the questions I had in mind. But now let's look at the severity of this case, the possible ramifications, and how this must have affected the Defense Department of the country while she was in charge, if these things actually turn out to be true. I'm just looking at, what that could have been.
Well, I think it does create a severe reputational risk and damage to the optics of the defense and our defense ministry. It also creates a lot of questions, I think, now with this allegation being ventilated in the public domain, and of course with the raid, as the Hawks have made that raid on the Speaker's house. It raises questions if we have to go back and start now reviewing all of the contracts, the transactions, the procurement processes that took place within the ministry under her leadership as Minister of Defense. And I think, that in itself becomes another arduous and onerous task on the state, because it also dampens the question around the state capacity to root out these kinds of transactional issues that happen in terms of procurement and how procurement should be much more accountable. The second point, I think, is it circles back to the Zondo Commission and the Zondo Commission of Inquiry into State Capture, and the recommendations that were made by Chief Justice Zondo at the time, where it was argued that something much more proactive, something much more engaging and much more emphatic needs to happen to address state capture, or to address the gray box or the black box of procurement in the country. So I think all of this kind of ties back and circles back to each other in not a good way. And I think this is now becoming quite a serious blight for the country in terms of the investor confidence, in terms of the business. Is this how you really do business in the country? And of course, the real challenge is trust of institutions, and not just institutions of the state, but I think across the board as well, in how people feel and what is their reaction to this whole situation.
I like what you just said last, and I'm also looking at, the grey list, FATF grey list and all of that. I'm looking at what perception are we giving and all of that. But then don't you think this also casts a shadow on her role, even as speaker?
Well, she came into that position in a very controversial way as well. So I don't think it can be much. It can be a deeper shadow than what she currently has hanging over her. I mean, she came into that role after the July 2021 riots. Remember, she was the Minister of Defense at the time. There was questions around what her department and ministry were doing, what kind of engagements and intelligence, and were they aware, and what kind of interventions were happening. She and the president were not on the same page. They were basically at odds with each other in terms of how to define it, whether it was a riot, whether it was an insurrection, whether it was a civil uprising. There were all of these things. She and the president really didn't come to a kind of agreement of how to approach this thing and what the interventions would be. And it was quite surprising, I think, that somebody needed to be held responsible. Should it have been the Minister of Police? Should it have been the Minister of Defense and Military and Veteran Affairs? Or should it have been the Minister of State Security? And I think we saw the fallout there. And the Minister at the time of State Security, and who should have been, or if I get it correctly, I don't know if it was Minister of State Security, but I know it was Ayanda Dodlo, who eventually took the rap for this and then was given given the kind of repercussions that she had to take. And then eventually she took a position out in the World Bank as a director. And yet the minister at the time, who's now the current speaker, got the position of Speaker of the National Assembly. So I'm not saying that this is not something we should take lightly or tread lightly on in terms of the shadows that follow her, but she hasn't been without shadows, is what I'm saying. It seems to follow her a lot. And now this is the latest kind of crisis that will also tarnish her as an individual and in terms of her own reputational risk.
Doesn't this come, at a bad time for Ramaphosa? I mean, he's vowed to clean up corruption in government, and the governing ANC, when he became president in February 2018, isn't this a further statement as to yet another failure in his anti-graft crusade?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends as well. When you're looking at the anti-corruption crusade and you look at what level of corruption takes place, and I suspect it's in Nigeria as well, right? You can go for the easy wins, which has been happening, and I don't want to be completely dismissive of where corruption has actually been addressed, where people that are involved in corruption have been actually brought to account. They have been the letter of the law, the judicial process has taken place. But I think, if you're thinking about the bigger levels of corruption, the deeper levels of corruption, whether it's South Africa, whether it's Nigeria, we got to accept that these things take time. And to answer your question, I could flip it around and ask you, how successful has it been in your country as well, in terms of the failure, in terms of dealing with the bigger levels of corruption? And who are the masterminds behind this corruption? We've had whistleblowers who have been very brave in this country to have shown the light in the dark spaces where procurement, corruption, and other levels of poor transactional issues have taken place without following regulatory frameworks. And those people have, essentially bore the brunt of being about openness, about transparency, and about whistleblowing. So we're seeing legislation, and we're seeing a shift in that way to protect some of the interests, not enough though. And of course, in the same way that if it hurts too close to the political architecture of the country, then we do know what happens in the context of corruption. So I'm not saying, I don't want to trivialize it to a point of casting and pointing fingers across the bow and saying whose corruption is more endemic and who's not. But I think the point is that
All right, I guess you're trying to talk about some of those things. I mean, it's corruption we're talking about here, and it's something that has to be dealt with. If you can hear me, I'd like you to go ahead. Maybe if you could just wrap up in 5 seconds, so we just take our last topic or last conversation.
Yeah, so I just want to finish off the point on corruption. I think, it's always going to be a blight on anyone's country, whether it's yours, whether it's mine, whether it's China, whether it's India, whether it's the EU, the US, any country. So I think that's a challenge. And that's going to be something that's going to be part of this election process going forward in terms of the campaigning and so forth. And I think that at the end of the day, however we root out corruption and however we eradicate corruption will always come with some pain.
All right, I guess we're pressed for time now, and we just have to wrap up here. It's been a pleasure having you, Sanusi Naidu, Senior Research Fellow, Institute for Global Dialogue.
Thank you.
All right, this is our episode, or that's it on this edition of Business Edge. Follow us on social media. We are at New Century TV. You can also go to our website, www.newcentral.africa. You can download our mobile app on Play Store and App Store. Till next time, I am Perpetua Fasami Peter. Bye for now.